Thank you all for coming out to this colloquium presentation. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Donald Brenes to our campus and to our department. Don's a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is a linguistic anthropologist, a sociocultural anthropologist, a real leader in our field. He's been editor of American Ethnologist, president of the American Anthropological Association, currently co-edits annual reviews of anthropology, and is a scholar with a wide-ranging set of interests, from work in the Pacific and Fiji, work on sound and music and law and gossip and policy. And in
Gossip's
fact,
my home turf.
And in fact, one of the things that is terrific about having him here right now in our lives is that some of his current lines of research are around questions of assessment and policy related to higher education. And we are increasingly being assessed and worrying about policy. So it's a great opportunity for us to talk with you and think with you around these issues. So please join me in welcoming Don.
Yes, clap now while you do it. No, thanks very much. And have you just weathered your external review?
Yes, we just got the written report about 3 weeks ago.
And you're smiling.
They were very good.
Well, my sense is they should have been. That's great. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is, as I was telling Andy, I gave, at least from the performance point of view, a coherently written paper at noon. This is going to be a bit more of an emergent performance. And also really a request for conversation, because this is a project, it's not just recent. Ever since I found myself enthralled by and to peer review processes and the like, I've been thinking about these kinds of issues and taking refuge in ethnography. And I finally become convinced, up to the point, I'm a linguistic anthropologist. I only write articles, but I got to write a book. So people who have strategies about how to put this together, and it's complicated in a lot of ways, and I'll try to highlight some of those. I'm also definitely, despite my noon performance, not going to fill the entire time with my own nattering on. I'm probably going to talk for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and then really open it up. And Andy said that you all dealt pretty well with informalities, so I'm happy to be dealt with. One of my favorite books and what I'm looking forward to teaching next quarter is Homegirls by Norma Mendoza-Denton, which is a great ethnography of speech at a Northern California high school, particularly among Latina young women. And one of the great things that Norma does in that book is to have something like 6 different prefaces. One addressed to the homegirls, one addressed to the parents, one to the school teacher. And, well, I don't have 6 different prefaces, but I do have 6 different starting points. So you can help me choose them. But, and because this is one of those cases where a project really found me. And so I want to start with a couple of motivational moments, then look at the sort of complex terrain that I'm trying to map out in a very quirky and idiosyncratic way, and then think about some of the implications it has for the kinds of institutions that we both participate in shaping and live our professional and, to a horrifying extent, our personal lives as well. Collegiality is one of the rewards. So a couple of these actually are in the nature of aha experiences, something I have relatively few of, but these were a couple of actual ones. One was I was lucky enough to participate in a research group on text and power for a couple of years that met in Chicago, and one weekend Pierre Bourdieu was the guest there, and he was doing a bit of self-flagellation about why has French sociology become so quantitative. Why do numbers matter so much? And of course, he'd done his own part in contributing to that. But it was also a real question, because he saw qualitative research as being at the core of what we can bring. And what I realized in this aha was, it was because there was a missing genre that nobody looked at, and that was the grant proposal. And I was totally wrong about many things in this claim, but it is the case that not many people have looked at grant proposals. But my notion was that you would write grant proposals in a way that would appear to be transparent in terms of what they were meaning, what they were claiming, could be evaluated, could gain a particular kind of authoritative voice, and that the language of quantitative research was much less idiolectal. And so subject to that. That has nothing to do with why French sociology became more quantitative at all. Grant proposals, in fact, doesn't have much to do with French sociology until the present day. On the other hand, it is a really crucial kind of genre. So that's one starting point, was thinking about grant proposals, and partly thinking about it because this was towards the end of the 80s. It was on the heels of what George Marcus now refers to as the cultural capital of the 80s. That is the kind of critique that came out of writing culture and the like, in which there was a great deal of interest and analytical weight placed on the finished text and looking at it and thinking about it in terms of generic, how genre expectations and audience expectations mapped into particular forms of representation and argumentation, what got left off. On the other hand, there was a sense that things stopped. When you wrote culture, culture had been written and then people would do with it what they will, but that was less material than what had gone into the formation of the text. And I realized that there's one thing about grant proposals is even if you don't get the money, they're consequential. So you have to pay attention to readership, to audience, to the kinds of, and my work in Fiji, which I'll talk a very little bit about, really it started out as work in comparative rhetoric and moved into work in comparative aesthetics. What was it from the point of view of an audience that gave particular political speeches or insult songs or gossip sessions, a particular kind of purchase? So first response, it's adding writing money to writing culture. Or the first story. The second one really came from the fact that around then, and I have an illustrious fellow recovering editor here, when I started editing AE, all of a sudden people came to me as if I were living in Delphi and sitting on a three-legged stool. I said, what is the future of anthropology as you bubble up from the depths? And I could do things like an informal lexical count from the 5 years that I was editor, probably had the H word as the most popular, which was hegemony for those of you who've forgotten yesterday's H word, followed closely by resistance with the small r. And certainly the wonderful thing, printouts that Laura Ahern has every year now in the American Ethnologist, which you have, and I forget the name for the genre, but hegemony, and various words represented proportional to their usage, is great. But I found that I was actually I had no predictive value whatever about what the hot topics were going to be, or what the theoretical drivers were likely to be. I had some things I liked and some I didn't, but I don't really do theory. But I got much more interested in the non-content kinds of elements that went on, and this is partly because certainly my work at Fiji was as much about form and style as it was about content. So gossip was great for what it was about, but it was also a pleasure because of how you co-participated in producing these hilarious texts and the like. So I began to think about what were the institutional and other kinds of conditions under which and within which a field is shaped in an ongoing way, not independent of, but complementary to what's going on in terms of intellectual change and transformation and rethinking. Third, that wasn't that much of an aha experience, but that was how I get out of answering a difficult question about where the field is going. So we have to look at what the vehicle is. So the third one was that I had started serving on peer review panels in the late 80s as well, and at one point very early on, I was flying back to Southern California when I was then living. I've been talking a great deal today already. Hit the water. Living, I was feeling really good. I thought, boy, I'm really good at this stuff. And then I realized what I was responding to was the fact that on this particular kind of fellowship application panel, you only had to actually talk to other members of the committee when there was more than 1.5 standard deviations between the high score and the low score. I was always in the middle. And there was this horrifying kind of aha moment in which I tend to think of myself as being quite weird, or at least idiosyncratic, having my own ideas. But somehow, over the course of 3 days of doing this, I had mapped out the middle ground. I didn't have to talk, I talked to people about everything else, but not about the fellowships. And there was something really interesting there, and it was something that really convinced me early on of another dimension that became important in the work, which is we learn how to become nonce bureaucrats. We're bureaucrats for the nonce, for the moment, and we're socialized into doing this and thinking about the process of socialization, recruitment, incorporation, and these kinds of practices is part of what really shapes our repertoire. As though not, I think of myself as having added bureaucratic actor to my repertoire rather than becoming a bureaucrat. But I do bureaucratic things from time to time. It's also, another starting point is the fact that I worked in Batgaon, or the community I call Batgaon in Fiji. The folks there were all mostly second and third generation descendants of people who had come as indentured laborers from North India, in the case of this village, all from North India. Spoke a variety of Hindi that was similar to the variety I already spoke from Peace Corps time on the Nepal-India border. And that gave me a particular perspective from which I was always being surprised by what went on in Batgaon, because it was a community that insisted upon its underlying egalitarian nature. That we know what our cousins' lives are like in India, it's all that caste stuff, but here we're all equal in the village. And I ended up writing in a number of contexts about Batgaon as an occasionally egalitarian community, because I was really focused on those kinds of events in which egalitarianism was collectively co-performed, or that kind of ethos was being acted out. And those were among the few relatively stable moments in Batgaon social life, because basically it was not quite animistic, I wouldn't use that language, but it was very hard for people to shape a social world beyond the immediate family. The British had, in contrast to what they did with the Fijians, had under-administered Indian communities. They were left to their own devices. The conflicts that mattered the most to the Indo-Fijian folks were not justiciable under the British legal system. And so that notion of enacting occasional egalitarianism became really central, and I started thinking as I sat on more and more, initially funding committees, that something similar may be going on in the context of these, on the face of it, extraordinarily hierarchical institutions. And this really came with, and I mentioned this in passing this morning, the notion that peer review is not only about reviewing aspirational peers or peers, but also reviewing with peers. And that particularly in the viva voce around the table discussions, that there is this kind of occasionally egalitarian practice that people are taking part in, at the same time that from the outside, certainly it's a hard and fast, nothing like getting a rejection letter from NSF to make you think this is the iron cage slamming shut. From the outside, it's monolithic. From the inside, it's actually very tentative in many ways, and tentative in terms of both the relationships among panelists, but also what happens with your advice, because nobody seems to make a final decision, or at least you don't get to make a final decision. You make recommendations. There are recursive audiences, and documents have afterlives. And then a final potential starting point, and you can see why this is a complicated process, is I increasingly became immersed in a really complex range of sites and institutions in which some really core aspects of scholarly life, or more generally, were being negotiated, transformed, and translated. I edited an American Ethologist, I was on lots of funding panels, I've probably been involved in about 30 external reviews. As a reviewer, I chaired a review of all of British social anthropology, which is another story altogether. About 10 years ago, I've been involved in a similar kind of thing for the Netherlands, doing a research review. So I've been an implicated actor in these kinds of settings, and Virginia is nodding from somebody who's been through similar kinds of experiences, and I think a lot of, again, senior folks have been. And one of the things that became really evident to me is this stuff matters. And it really matters for the future of the discipline. It matters for the future of particular modes of scholarship, research, production, and circulation. And it really matters for the lives of folks who are in the mix. I don't, those of you who are recidivist as students who actually went to the first one, this will not be quite as depressing. There are some outs in this talk. But don't lose heart. I mean, but we have to pay attention. And one thing that we're extraordinarily good at as anthropologists is paying attention. And paying attention in surprising kinds of ways. Not making claims for my work, particularly, but it's something that I'll challenge you all to keep your ears and eyes open for. So now, several dozen articles later on this, I'm trying to figure out how to put it all together. And I wanted first to say a few things about why it's, a little bit about why it's an ethnographic process, or the sort of points of research entry that I had, then talk a little bit about what the field of play out there is in terms of anthropology. One of the things that I love what goes on in anthropology in terms of theory and engagement with both traveling theories and our own theories and the like, those kinds of internalist explanations of what's going on, but that's not the whole case, and it needs to be complicated by thinking about these external and interacting contexts. So I do have a handout which will clarify nothing but give you something on which to draw arrows, hopefully not pointed at anyone. But some your own connective kinds of points to look at some of those kinds of extra-disciplinary or out of the intellectual into the administrative or political or bureaucratic world connections we're always invited in. So, involved in. So this is ethnography of a very particular sort. One thing that's really interesting is, going back to the cultural capital of the 80s, a lot of that was the critique of the notion of ethnography. And we've critiqued ethnography for lots of good reasons, to lots of good effects. We have a much stronger sense of its limitations, possibilities, and the like. What we've paid much less attention to is its paraphrase, which is participant observation. And this is sort of experience near for me, because while I certainly participated, my Hindi was just fine, and I had a great time hanging out with folks, I was much more of an observer than a participant in the context at Fiji. Here, from the get-go, to use a technical term, I've always been primarily a participant, and then a participant who at times is taking notes in the context, and what notes you take and about what is another kind of issue, both epistemological and ethical, but also reflecting on it. You know, and so it makes there real epistemological, representational, ethical complexities to how you write this up and how you talk about it. And I'm relatively satisfied with some of the compromises, but I need advice. So it's participant observation. It's research that I've pursued primarily in the context of particular kinds of events. And I come out of linguistic anthropology at a time when there was a close alliance with folklore and other performance studies, and the sort of ethnography of speaking, ethnography of communicative practice school, where the locus of activity is events, these sorts of bounded moments which people get together and do things in particular kinds of forms. And the event that I spent a lot of time in, actually in Fiji to some extent, but subsequently, particularly, are meetings. And I actually, 4 weeks ago, was at a wonderful meeting. My wife says this is my meta fall, because next week I'm going to a conference on the concept of the concept. Well, 2 weeks ago was a meeting on the ethnography of meetings with a couple of us older people and a bunch of really terrific young Swedish and American scholars who have been doing ethnography in bureaucratic sites, and it's really extraordinary stuff. Helen Schwartzman I would credit as my doppel from Northwestern, as my doppelganger on this. And one of the things that goes on in meetings, and this is the third ethnographic component of the project, is that people are recruited into and socialized into what's going on. We learn how to be meeting participants of all sorts of meetings. I mean, the only thing that's more striking than how much you learn as a participant is when you learn how to chair one. Virginia had a gift for it from the beginning. So looking at socialization, how you learn to do bureaucratic things of various sorts, how you sort of get control over the style and the form, and where there's room for play and where there isn't room for play, how you engage folks. And the like, that's all ongoing learning. And there clearly Jean Lave was a major inspiration, the whole, thinking through communities of practice, because we are all, even at my advanced years, being socialized into new communities of practice. Fourth element is really around, that's ethnographic about it, is that I was really fascinated by language and communicative form and the ways that people talk. And I mentioned this just in passing this morning, the fact that often there was a great deal of joking that went on in NSF panel meetings. And joking was at times, in fact, instigated by the program officer who was trying to set in a safe, performative way the outer limits for debate. And after those two folks had staked out the outer margins, everybody else could then negotiate in the middle. I was always one of the outer margin kinds of guys. This is anthropology's role in many of these events. And I'll talk a little about language. A fifth is that you can't really understand ethnographically what's going on in processes of evaluation and assessment unless you pay attention to materiality. That there are things that matter, that are material and that matter in material ways in the processes. So, and here certainly I've been really influenced by, not whole hog, but in many ways by actor network theory and some of the work in STS. One of the ways in which you're socialized into being a good grant reader is being provided data on, tabular data on how many you've read, what your standard deviation is, what the median score is. You're always provided information. You fill out forms when you're applying for a grant, when you're recommending somebody for a grant, when you're evaluating a grant. And these forms are not just open prompts, to use that awful term that students now use instead of assignments. They're not just open prompts that says, tell me whether this is good or not. They guide you through a series of adjectival moves that lead you to a categorical claim about what the quality of the proposal is, or the quality of the graduate student being recommended, or whatever it is. These documents are not neutral forms, and there's a lot of really interesting things that go on. With documents, there also are, apart from documents, other kinds of templates and ways of structuring reports. I was on the committee of visitors, which was two of us, who were part of a larger group looking at all of the Division of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences at NSF this summer. And the two of us who were doing anthropology, we had a template where we had to address this issue, then address this issue, then address this issue. And there was very little free writing, to use another student expression. At the end, there's this, if you're looking for a nexus of contestable disciplining, certainly filling out a form is. And there's a reciprocal relationship between forms and meetings, because forms generate and catalyze and provide raw materials for meetings, and then meetings take shape and have afterlives in terms of what goes onto the forms and to the minutes and various other. So there's a complex relationship between meetings as events and forms and documents, whether electronic or on paper, as their product and provocation. Another element that thinking about it ethnographically has to do with time, and that it's operated, that my work has been operating in a diachronic framework, both at the level of following cases through, and in some cases being able to interview people from when they're starting to apply for a grant proposal, and then following it through all the stages, and then where it leads afterwards. So using that kind of, I'm a very old school anthropologist. I do on one side Manchester School, on the other side ethnography of speaking. It hasn't changed in. The Manchester folks write about cases and following actual connected action through time is a crucial way of understanding what becomes enlistable as social structure and social organization and cultural value. But there's also the case of what at the time I thought was a sort of slow change in time over what the ideological and practitioner-based framework was for doing evaluation. That's all changed much more rapidly than I would have expected. And the transformation of going from paper forms, which represented a sort of, if you've ever seen the old NSF style assessment forms, there are 5 different typefaces that clearly reflect different points at which the original form was Xeroxed, and then a new typeface, the hip typeface of the year came in, then another typeface. Now it's all electronic, much more standardized, and it's really different. Trust me, we'll come back to the change. Another has to do, the reason it's an ethnographic project is it has to do with comparison and with thinking about the context for these practices of assessment, whether department reviews, personnel cases, manuscript reviews, grant proposal evaluations, and the like, is to think comparatively about it. And I've been lucky enough for the past 15 years or so to be really involved with colleagues in Europe, and to some extent in Australia and New Zealand, who are working under very different kinds of regimes, one of the, American exceptionalism doesn't really work as a big explanation, but we really are different in the respect that institutionally we're really pluralistic. There's not a single government agency that determines what we can do, whereas that's certainly the case in Denmark. Well, it's certainly the case throughout Europe now, where there's been so much pressure to homogenize the system for the transferability of people for jobs in the knowledge, seen as a knowledge economy, that in theory a German degree in a particular field means the same thing as a Dutch, as an Italian, as a Danish, or as a British. So comparison is really important. It's also important for me because a lot of the language that people become passionate about in higher education administration and research funding is imported piecemeal from these kinds of European regimes, and the Australians and the New Zealanders are actually more rigid about the regimes than the Europeans are. So comparison both suggests that the packages don't always come tied up in the same way, that there are different ways in which the elements could be put in and put together. And we may feel ourselves to be under the assessment gun a lot, but it's much less. And it's also of a different nature from what goes on in particularly the UK, which I'd be happy to talk about. Finally is all this stuff, and this is, simple anthropology, is deeply embedded in a whole range of other kinds of practices, linguistic ideologies, ways of thinking about value, ways of thinking about innovation, ways of thinking about the relationship between conventional knowledge and extraordinary knowledge, and how you balance those, and also manage the risk. I'm going to steal a word from you. The risk that's attendant on maybe going over too far on the innovative side and the like. So here, for your bemusement, you can, at the very least, fan yourselves with it from the hot air.
I'll be back with some more.
Are you gonna make more? Just because.
Yeah, don't. This is a kind of mapping out of, again, taking the world of anthropology outside that sphere of where we're talking scholarship and talking theory and looking at where we intersect, sometimes with ourselves and our colleagues just in different roles. And I'll wait till the... This is, I'm not going to walk through every point. Don't lose heart. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. That first chunk there above the line that goes across is sort of looking at those points of intersection with other institutions or other kinds of practices that we're involved in. Below the heavy line is really thinking about some of the kinds of processes that occur in these sorts of extra academic anthropology interactions, and then there are three magic words that are tossed in there for the benefit of the linguistic anthropologist that I found helpful in thinking about all this. I'll say something first about the stuff down at the bottom, keywords, proxies, and shifters, because this is a language, it partly comes out of semiotics, it partly comes out of the kind of language that folks who do evaluation use themselves, which is derived from microeconomic modeling and the like. So everybody know what a proxy is? That a proxy is sort of a synecdoche from hell, or sometimes they're used for divine purposes, but a proxy is taking a part and having it stand for the whole, or some attribute of a much more complicated phenomenon. So a proxy, for example, of the environmental consciousness of a particular organization might be the proportion of Priuses that are parked outside. That may be an indicator of sorts, and in the ordinary mortal word for proxy is indicator. And indicators are absolutely central to probably any of the areas that you're working, whether it's police, looking at international human rights regimes. The language of international governance is indicators or proxies, making these synecdochic kinds of claims. I spent 10 years probably on the Graduate Research Fellowship panels at NSF. One of the things that was striking there was they had a very complex regression analysis of what mattered the most to different panels in making their judgments about and ranking about applicants for these fellowships. You should feel good if you ever got one. You should feel good if you got an honor. You should feel good if you survived applying for it. But the thing that was most striking was when I started on that panel, there was an indicator for the quality of the undergraduate institution to which the applicant had gone. You know what that was? That was the average SAT of the entering students at that institution. It had nothing to do with what went on at the institution, but it was quantitative. It could be found, it could be located, and it was thought to somehow map it. That's proxy in its hellish incarnation. Second term down, there are key words, and you've probably had some exposure to I hope you've had some exposure to Raymond Williams and the like, and I tend to think of key words as the sort of overstuffed couches of cultural analysis. They've got so much meaning and so much content and so many rich histories, and Frito's lost down in the cracks. And, everything is sedimented there. So they're over-rich. In some ways, shifters are, and this is following Jacobson and Michael Silverstein to some extent, and also the great work that Bonnie Orcioli has done on liberal arts colleges. As content, shifters are words that are actually semantically almost totally vacuous. They don't mean anything, but they apply across all sorts of domains, and they originally come into a field from another domain. So most of you are too young to remember the heyday of excellence as what all academic worlds were about. We were striving for excellence, which was clearly borrowed from Tom Peters' excellence in management notion. It came over, nobody knew what excellence was, how it was operationalized. It is probably still there in the University of Illinois' fundraising materials. But these shifters are really powerful. Diversity is another shifter. It's not semantically vacuous, but it's semantically deeply contested and becomes vacuous in part because it never really refers to anything, but it locates the discourse of a particular institution in relationship to a broader set of institutions out there. Flexibility, in the sense that Emily Martin wrote about it a couple of books ago, is a similar kind of shifter. It links domains, and it has great, powerful resonances, to use an image from my sound life, or the sounder part of my life. But it doesn't in itself mean anything. What I want to do briefly here with a quick preface is to plunge into looking at some of these places and processes of the intersection, just make a few observations, and then turn to a bit of an opening things up for discussion. When I started out, and I really am, I'm not directly the child of Manchester, I'm actually Laura Nader's first academic grandchild. I worked with her first graduate student. And one of the concerns that came out of the country, and also a very good friend and colleague, and one of the concerns that really informed my work early on was really looking at it, and I can sort of track it from at that time teaching at a small liberal arts college, the intrusion of legal institutions into college campuses in a lot of ways. This came to a head with the Reagan administration's threat of cutting off all funding for colleges where drinking was allowed, even of those who were old enough to drink. But I'm now much less worried about legal intrusion than I am about bureaucratic intrusion. And it's not the processes of spectacular moments of overregulation so much as of quotidian installations of new forms of interaction, evaluation, and practice that people don't really notice necessarily. You notice it only when it really is a burr under your saddle, but it sneaks up on you in the way that judicial intervention does. And the judicial stuff is still clearly going on, particularly as in the debates about the other really significant questions around sexual harassment and sexual violence. It's going to be really complicated to see how that pans out. I'm not on that committee. But to turn to the handout, just a few quick thoughts on a few of the elements. One is, and this is an example where we move from a simple indicator to a much more complex one in terms of thinking about teaching. Certainly the part of the assessment for all of you who are teaching fellows or teaching assistants, faculty members, lab supervisors and the like, teaching is always evaluated. At Santa Cruz, teaching is always evaluated now it's evaluated by electronic forms distributed in the last week of class, which nobody ever fills out because they're too busy writing the papers. And we haven't figured out the sanction to make people actually fill them out. I'm not part of that we, but the institution hasn't figured out what the sanction should be. But in the old days, there used to be, a Scantron form, basically, that you would pass out the last day of class when students had their mind on many other things. This is not a good way to do evaluation, but it does provide a proxy. It's something that appears to be clear and that you can work with and that can be plugged into algorithms for mapping. Now it's being replaced by, I don't know if you've had to deal with program learning outcomes yet? You have?
Elsewhere.
Elsewhere. Program learning outcomes are one of those things that the accrediting agencies are very big on in terms of how do we know what comes out of an education? Is there any value added? How do you get at it? How do you measure it? What do you do if people don't fulfill their program learning? And at the program learning level, it has to do with what a departmental major might look like. What are your goals for your students in anthropology in the major, and what do you want them to be able to do at the end, and how do you measure it? And these are out there in that sort of vast area of potentially consequential, though not necessarily directly consequential phenomena. There are also individual learning objectives that sometimes feed into personnel assessment practices, which are they're good in that they don't rely on a single proxy, but they rely on a complex of proxies which may be as problematic as in other areas. So there are complicated things going on in relationship of anthropology to teaching and its assessment. In terms of scholarly publications, there are a whole range of issues, some of which have to do with the relationships between associations and their own journals, some of which have to do with the broader scene out there. Certainly there are three elements I'll just mention in passing, the first of which is the growing cost of publication. It's something that AAA is struggling with this year, actually, in terms of the fact that we're going to have to see about ways of folks parsing out the field of section journals in terms of the kinds of media that they use or the kinds of support that they get from the association and the like, because it's impossible to continue funding as we do. And it certainly is underlay part of the impetus towards open access journals and the like, and the requirement of things appearing in open access journals at the same time that there's no funding cost for the infrastructure that's necessary to make something publishable in a journal. There's a related issue to this, and it also has to do with the transformation from association-based journals into private publishing-based journals, which has not been the case for AAA yet. It's one reason it's still fighting the battle, which has to do with the notion of the knowledge economy and knowledge as a commodity. And for a variety of reasons, we live in the middle of Palo Alto, surrounded by folks in the industry. And it's quite clear that knowledge, we're seen as content providers, that is, as the non-software writing, non-hardware building. Folks, we're content providers. The question is how to make our content marketable, but also taxable in terms of profit points. And so there's been a real shift over the now 15 years or so I've been involved in this, longer than that, thinking about these issues towards knowledge as a commodity. And a final point, just quickly, about this intersection of academic anthropology with its journals and with publication generally. Lindsay Waters is a very smart, knowledgeable editor at the Harvard University Press. A number of years ago, published a prickly paradigm consideration of what he saw as the crisis in scholarly publishing. And this is in reaction largely to the part that many major university presses have discontinued their series in literary studies. That it was increasingly difficult to get published in literary studies at the same time that many schools were upping the tenure ante for fields, particularly in the humanities, sometimes as with the University of Pennsylvania, to a second book before tenure. And Waters makes a point that part of this is in the context of what he saw as the offshoring of evaluative responsibility. That is, that instead of colleagues in the department being willing to read, evaluate, think about, and actually make comments on their colleagues' work, that you send it off to specialists. And there are good reasons to send it to specialists, but if you send it totally to specialists, you sort of abdicate, well, you put it in the hands of folks who are never going to, and the specialists only weigh in terms of should it be published as a book or not, which is subject to lots of constraints other than the quality of what the, I'm almost off the soapbox, but that's a real issue, and there is, and this actually was one of the upshots that came from talking with several of the people after the morning version of what was actually a different paper, which is that there really is, for a whole variety of reasons, a real desire to have other people tell you whether something's good or not, rather than make those decisions yourself. And there are really complex issues around making those decisions yourself or making those decisions collegially in a department meeting. But it's something that seems, crucial as partly a way of dealing with the context, but also of collegial relations. These processes on publication and funding and the like are often mediated through forms and documents. One of the things that was really striking, and I did a paper a number of years ago looking at the change in NSF forms from 1995 to 1996. Probably the world's dullest topic in a very boring field site. And this is the one where it went from the highly Baroque, ornate, palimpsestical set of typefaces to the make it look like a computer, even if it's on paper. But one of the things that's really interesting, if you turn the paper over, there are instructions. How many of you have ever reviewed a grant proposal? Okay. On the back of the page or accompanying it, there are instructions for evaluators. From 1995 earlier, you were to evaluate for NSF papers or proposals in terms of 4 criteria, the last of which was the minimalist one and was relatively obscure, didn't always apply, and that was contribution to the infrastructure of science and technology. And the others had to do with track record, value of the scholarly value of the project, and feasibility of the project, essentially. There was a restudy part of Al Gore's reduction of paperwork enterprise in the 90s, which was in many ways a laudable thing. They got rid of the track record because that was something that generated the replication of status differentials in terms of who got the proposals funded. That was a good thing. At the same time, they changed the criteria to where they now ask only 2 questions that count equally. One is, what's the scholarly value of this? The second is, what are the broader impacts? And the one thing I can tell you is broader impacts really matter rhetorically. And they really matter in terms of, there's Deb Winslow, who's a friend who's the program officer at NSF, one of the 2 for anthropology, says the first thing she does when she gets a paper that someone, think about crossing genres all the time. When she gets a proposal that she really wants to fund, she has to convince the author to rewrite the abstract and to highlight, in fact, often to put in the first paragraph. She says, sometimes I do it for them, the broader impacts, and then go on to talk about the scholarly value. This is the one practical bit of advice you get from me, write about broader impacts. People reading it do not have a canonical vision of what broader impacts are, but that taking it seriously matters. When we were doing this review this summer, we were asked to read all these jackets of proposals to see how seriously the reviewers and the program directors were taking broader impacts. And that's because the program officers are not the final audience, Congress is the final audience. And there is this sense of recursive audiences out there that you unfortunately need to be mindful of. Okay, what else can I say? Far too much, but let me say a few things. Closely linked to these kinds of documentary and evaluative processes are university policies and sub-policy level passions. And we're saved by our institutional pluralism. Nonetheless, questions of transparency, accountability, and the like are borrowed whole hog from the UK, from basically the UK system, and to some extent from Australia and New Zealand. And the EU, to its regret, borrowed them through the Bologna Accords to some extent from the UK as well. They are differentially applied here in the UK, where there is one agency that funds all teaching, there's one agency that funds all research, or one collection of agencies. There's absolute they're in a position to absolutely make demands on how evaluation is done and what's funded, what needs to be taken into account, what shouldn't be taken into account. That seeps over here. There's a certain kind of what I think of as discursive seepage that comes over here, and it becomes a passionate topic for accrediting agencies or universities or individual deans. So bits and pieces of it pop up. But if you're good ethnographers, you could think as a chair or soon to be recovering chair. You think about, okay, so what are they fetishizing these days? But again, even here, it has consequences. One of the struggles that was actually won with the Bush White House, the second Bush White House, was that Margaret Spellings, who was his Secretary of Education, wanted to require that there be someone from the Department of Education on every accreditation panel in the U.S. And accreditation is what we essentially get our license from. And we are still accredited by voluntary associations, which are voluntary associations of schools, colleges, and universities, but there's actually no state intervention. There's a lot of state pressure, and we fought back on some of the extent, the intention to get the feds more directly involved in accreditation processes, but it could, for a variety of reasons, be catastrophic. That points to another sort of area over there in the mysterious right-hand side of the handout, which is voluntary associations. This is another, it's not an American exceptionalist thing, but Tocqueville was right. We still spend a lot of time in voluntary associations. Some of these are at the level of accreditation and trusting, and medical associations are similar, bar associations are similar. They control membership and make decisions that are somewhat unlinked to from government agencies. I wanted to say something just in passing about other kinds of voluntary associations, which a number of us here spent a lot of time, and that's really thinking about scholarly associations, the AAA, Linguistic Society of America, whatever, the Criminology, the Law and Society Association. There are a whole range of them out there. And one of the things that's really important, and Virginia can testify even more anecdotally to the goofiness of some of the things one does in associations like the AAA, but one of the ways of thinking about voluntary associations is we help to coordinate the collective carving out of space where there's a sort of at least, autonomous realm for discussion, debate, for doing science and moving things forward and thinking critically about policy. And like Mario Biaggi, who's a historian of science, who's done terrific work in a whole range of ways on scholarly publishing in the early modern period, makes a really compelling argument that peer review originated not in the notion that peers should be evaluating the scientific worthiness or accuracy of particular work, but rather that they were part of a compact between royal academies in both France and England on the one hand, and the governments, to say, give us this space, we will self-regulate ourselves within it. That they were charged essentially with shaping a space in which debate could take place as long as it was controlled in ways that would not have an effect on the state as a whole. And that actually the scientific dimension or the outcomes or rigor dimension of peer review comes along considerably longer. So those of you who are asked to review manuscripts, every time you do that, you're helping to keep this semi-autonomous field a little more open. The one other thing I'll mention just in passing, and then I'll say a few things that come out quickly, that come out of this, and then I will blessedly stop talking, has to do with human subjects review, which is something else that is, everybody starts coughing. Say IRB and it triggers.
Start raising your nose.
Would you like some water? Now known as IRBs, but at the time I started studying, they're called Human Subjects Review. One of the things that's really remarkable here is it demonstrates the capacity of institutions, state and otherwise, to overgeneralize from cases. I mean, there's every reason to be really concerned about the ethical dimensions of what we're doing. It's also the case that there's every reason to think that one indicator doesn't fit all, and that one kind of practice is not generalizable across the board. It's also the case that the federal interest in the Bush years in institutional review boards is basically driven by some incredibly high-profile medical research malpractice cases, and that we're living with a model that comes out of biomedical research and very particular kinds of wholly legitimate concerns and some indicators that actually sort of fit what's going on. For anthropology and for other fields, and nobody has written with more sort of spirit and insight about this than Raina Lederman at Princeton, and finally has a book coming out on it, is that it doesn't really work for anthropology. It doesn't work for oral history. The oral historians actually managed to get the feds to say that they were artists rather than scientists, because that way they could use people's names when people wanted their names used, because it was a work of artistry rather than a science. I'm sorry, that's the way classificatory schemes work. The other thing I'll just mention in passing about human subjects review is it used to be a largely internal and, again, peer review process within disciplines and fields, and there were lots of egregious times when it didn't work, but also it worked much of the time. What's really interesting now, and I mentioned the notion of meta-expertise in relationship to thinking about evaluation in the talk earlier today at some point. There's a similar issue here, is now there are experts in IRB assessment who are the only people who know the procedures, the codes, and the evaluative framework, the templates and the like, who know nothing about the subject matters. So one of the key questions, and one reason Rena's work is so invaluable and some other folks have written really effectively about this, is how you translate into those languages and those forms what it is that gives value to what it is that we do as anthropologists. And in some ways, that's one, if there is a take-home as you stagger out of this seminar, part of the take-home is the question of translation. How do you make it clear that the same language doesn't mean the same thing to all folks in all contexts? That it has the language is always contextually focused, that it holds on to the local and the situational, and shapes the local and the situation in powerful and quite distinctive ways. And how do you make that kind of situated nature of what we do, as well as the differences across the linguistic codes matter? So let me just run down a few themes that slowly emerge out of thinking about this work. And one of the things I should say about it is it started out being much more ethnographic. My work on peer review was really not cranky and critical at all. It was a little bemused at the traps I fell into myself as a practitioner in a series of papers that I wrote as my AAA address, and then for a plenary talk I gave for the Europeans a few years later, and the one that sort of emerged today. It's really thinking much more, not any more passionately, but more explicitly about how can we try to intervene and what sorts of interventions are possible for us in this kind of a sphere. Well, here are some of the themes with which I'm engaged. First is accountability, which is a little less with us now than it had been a few years ago, is a shifter of sorts. Nobody knows quite what it means, but it's a good thing. But it's not a good thing when it means that certain kinds of practices that are anathema to what we do and the values we have works. Not all of its meanings are benign. A second thing that comes out, and this is more substantive, is that transdisciplinarity is more than a desired word. It's something that there's a great deal of money in funding. Transdiscipline, my ears cleared. Either that or some ventilating machine just went off. That there's been a shift from disciplinary-based questions to problems that require transdisciplinary intervention, examination, and solution, which is really interesting, particularly depending on who gets into the transdisciplinary mix. Anthropologists are actually in a very good position to look at themselves in this kind of a field, but we're not necessarily always focused on the problem-based definition rather than the question-based. There's an implicit communicative theory that underlies both what goes on in the feds and in some of the more enthusiastic quarters of higher education institutions. One is the notion that things should be translatable, and that related to this, that factors that are being talked about should be commensurable. One of the goals behind having a transparent language of evaluation is you can see who's doing better. You're using the same terms, you're weighing things. I've written about this elsewhere as coercive commensurability. You know, you put the scores together and then you've got a clear, unbiased, non-parochial sense of value. One of the things that's really interesting in this is NSF is actually cognizant of the notion of things being commensurable, and they've had a number of working groups trying to develop policies for how do you deal with supporting research that doesn't quite fit in, which is actually true of much transdisciplinary research. And another aspect of this communicative theory, or this communicative ideology out there, is that skills, findings, and the like should all be transferable, but there should be some way of moving back and forth across contexts and the like, that there's a pigeonholing of disciplines in terms of what they can bring to the table, but the last thing you want to be is stuck in your discipline, so you have to always be thinking about how does this go over into another field? How does it work that my colleague Andrew Matthews does on climate science actually go into climate science? Things like this. There are differential effects. This is another broader theme that's come out on different kinds of fields and institutions. As I mentioned this morning, citation analysis really works for fields where people read and respond to each other's work very rapidly, but because you only count the footnotes within a year, 2 years after publication, it really does not work to the interests of cultural anthropology, where we take a ruminative time to process it. Write about it on our qualifying exams, read about the annual review, and then say something about it. I mean, we tend to have different, for legitimate and understandable reasons, have different processes. There are also invisible infrastructural demands of offloading the labor. It's less evident here than elsewhere. I mean, one of the things that I really admire about British anthropology, British social anthropology, is they led the charge when the first research assessment exercise was proposed to make it a peer review process rather than one where there was a template to be filled out by bureaucrats. And I do bureaucratic things, it's not an anti-bureaucrat. But who would you rather have making the judgments? And for 5 iterations of the RAE, the anthropologists did this, coordinated through the Association for Social Anthropologists. Now it's now in a different regime. And all of us, one of the things, I absolutely loved editing American Ethnologists. I continue to love editing, you know, and it's probably what my inner self is. But I had not realized, as I learned about two years into it, that what I actually would do would be to master a new genre, which was that of writing tenure and promotion letters for people whose articles I had published. Does this seem familiar?
Absolutely.
That's an invisible infrastructural demand. The one thing I'd say, if you ever get in this position, don't let it be claimed that this is just service. This is really shaping intellectual discourse in a very dialogic way. Claim all the credit you can for it. But it's invisible and it adds to the work as to writing letters and all that stuff. The other theme, and I will actually come close to stopping here, has to do with questions of value. That one of the things that's really been striking, and now I realize it's 25, I guess I first published on this in '88, so it's a very long project, has been there's a real transformation in the relationship between science and academia on the one hand and public on the other, and a real redefinition of many members of the public, and particularly legislative views, of what research is about. And this is evident in my capacity as chair of our academic senate. I meet with all the other senate chairs once a month with Jenna Napolitano, who's head of our system, and who's in the middle of this ongoing battle with Jerry Brown, because Jerry Brown's a very smart and well-educated guy who I greatly admire in almost all respects, except he has no sense of why research should be done in universities rather than by private businesses. That university went to a Jesuit school. I don't know if that's related. refer to people who went to Jesuit schools. But he doesn't see the need for knowledge production as being core to what we do and core to the other things that he does value, like teaching. And the like. And I think there's been a dramatic shift to both move beyond professional peer review, that is peer review by folks who are within the discipline, to consultation with stakeholders, which may mean end users, other people who have material interest in what's going on. And there's a lot to be said for stakeholder panels, which also include academics, but it shifts the locus of who's making decisions about value. It's also the case, and here I'll just reiterate, that broader impacts are taken seriously. Why do you do research if it's not meant to pay off? One of the founding dogmas for our National Science Foundation in 1947 was that there was value in basic research, in research that investigated questions because they were interesting and because you could learn things from it, but where it didn't need to be leading to anything. That's very, very different now over the past 15 years, at least. And so the question of where the value lies is really important. And also the question of what the product is and who owns it. Some relatively recent book, like Derek Bach's book on universities in the marketplace, argue that universities are now playing to buyers much more than they used to. That's part of it, but I think it's also the case that what has happened over the past 20 years has really transformed those kinds of discourses in which we ourselves are embedded and in which we ourselves participate about why what we do matters. And it's a hard, Corinne McSherry is a very smart lawyer who works with the Open Frontier Foundation now, has a great book called Who Owns Intellectual Work, and she makes an argument there's been a dramatic shift from what as late as the mid-1990s was an internal economy of exchange within academia, where things sort of moved freely back and forth across academics and scientists, and that there was a collective value to that, to a market economy externally in relationship to outside stakeholders and consumers, but also that gets read back then into internal decision-making about what matters and where the value is. So in closing, those sweet words for all involved. A couple of quick things I'd say, and then a closing metaphor, as if I haven't loaded enough on you. One is that I think it's really important, and one of the reasons I love, particularly meeting with graduate students and younger faculty, and also doing editorial work, is there's so much great work that people do in anthropology, and so much of a sense of why it both matters and is really interesting. And I think that some way that we can collectively continue to hold open that kind of space, the Piaggiolian-esque, Piaggiolian? I don't know how to make the adjective out of his name, but that kind of open space for discussion, engagement, exchange, and the like, the better, because that not only, and I worked in the Southwest Pacific, albeit with Indo-Fijians, exchange matters. And one of the ways that we can shape that kind of intellectual world that we want is to participate in exchanges within it. That also engenders, or has the possibility of engendering trust both in ourselves and in our value. See, the other thing is really a closing metaphor that I'm stealing from Michael Silverstein, who's a hard guy to steal from, and Stefan Helmreich, who's a little easier to get your hands around. But I've been talking for years when I've been doing this about translation, and in a piece on listening to underwater sounds from a deep submersible that figures also in his chapter in Alien Ocean. But it had an article in AE that preceded it. Helmreich writes about listening down there on the floor, and he writes about it. You're not hearing directly what's going on out there. Everything you hear is because of a process called transduction. And you all are much savvier than I am about the electronic world, but transduction basically means a conversion of one kind of energy into another kind of energy. You are all sitting here transducing me right now. I'm making the air vibrate, your timpani are vibrating, it's being converted into electrical signals. That's the transductive part of it, and then it's getting reconstituted in terms of whatever miracles of processing are going on. Out there, we transduce all the time. And the reason I like it is to use that notion of translation, not just of the meaning, but of the force and energy that underlie the context in which the meaning is being made and negotiated. Maybe a way of thinking forward towards some ways of getting out of these binds, or of at least making a clear statement as the ship sinks. But the ship is not sinking. Thanks so much for your patience. And I'm happy to take advice. So this is, when I grew up in New Mexico, and one of the highlights of the New Mexico State Fair, they may have had it the Arizona State Fair too, but the New Mexico State Fair was the tractor square dance, where you have 8 large tractors, and maybe they could do this in Illinois, out there do-si-doing, which is quite a sight to see. Well, I presented here something of a tractor square dance, of a lot of large, disparate, noisy, and not wholly clearly defined elements, but I'd love advice on what you think might matter, what you think might be helpful in terms of shaping a kind of coherent argument. Actually, when I write articles, some administrators read them, so I'm not always this incorrigible. Yeah.
That's so great. It makes me think of some of the people know in this room. I run the first semester of a course where first-year graduate students come in and sort of hear from different faculty members what their career's been like, and I made a theme to the discomfort of a number of faculty members funding, and how was your career funded? How did you get funding for your research? And some have gone on and said, well, it hasn't really mattered to me, and it's been pretty amazing to listen to each person, because you'll get behind the story, well, yeah, this, and this, and they're very resistant to it, and so I think you're tapping into a kind of, what's the word that we use, for, a culture that people don't talk about, the unspoken, that kind of, like, we know it works, we don't sort of want to know, we don't want to admit to ourselves, there's a lot going on there, so I really appreciate that. And it's also changed so much over time, people who were in graduate school in the 70s and 80s have a much different story than the ones who just were graduated in the last 2000. But my question is actually about me. Well, my value, what's my value? Apparently the proxy for my value is getting in a job at Harvard. If I got a job offer at Harvard, then I would be valued by this university, or if I got a job offered at Arizona State, I wouldn't necessarily be valued. And I just wondered if there was anything that contributed to your, that you've looked at in terms of university valuing of faculty members that has to do with going out and getting other job offers, which is basically the only way we can get.
And I would like to chime in. My comment was actually going to be, so I've just come in as an assistant professor, and I have come into the field being told that I should expect to go on the market before tenure, because regardless of publications and service and funding, the extra element of securing tenure is to have an offer from another university. So
That's something new every year.
So that it really resonated that the sending out of evaluation for publications, right, rather than internal. I think for raises, it comes from a job offer from another comparable or higher institution, right? And then tenure. So those things, it's been projected onto that next level, where I've been told to expect that as what I have to do in that year to secure tenure.
So that's a whole other genre of scholarly writing, thinking of the new.
Right, but so it parallels, I think, at each stage.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of things I could say about it. One thing is, I'll tell you one more thing about two other things about myself. One is I taught for many years at Pittsburgh College. And Claremont was an experimental college, lots of interdisciplinary teaching. I became accustomed to teaching far beyond my competences across fields, which educated me no end, and accounts for my peculiar rhetorical style. But I didn't need to worry about stuff very much there. So I didn't, which was great. But it's not a wholly but then thing. And then I went to what I thought was Pitzer's big sister, which was Santa Cruz. Pitzer with graduate students up in the Redwoods rather than the Chaparral. And there were some good things and some bad things. One of the great things was I already came in as an old guy. So I was not subject to, this is outrageous. Both of them are outrageous examples, but yours really is. But I also came into the UC system. And the UC system is really interesting because every faculty member below full professor is reviewed every 2 years. And every time you're reviewed, the expectation is you get a salary increase, a serious salary increase. We don't do piddly-addly, to use the Southwesternism. Little departmental,
That
they're,
translates well here.
they were above, So, if you're doing the stuff that ordinary would fall under the rubric of what you do, and we protect our junior colleagues from service, and we've got a great department, we take care of each other, and also run interference. But you can count on it. But it goes on forever. When you get to be when you're tenured, it's still every 2 years. Then when you get full professor, it becomes every 3 years. But after 15 years, because the notion is you're 3 years in each step, and there is a real salary, then you have what's called the barrier promotion. And the barrier promotion is, they send out, it's like doing a tenure review or a
Oh, wow.
It's called
first
fifth,
step.
the fifth step?
It's between step 5 and step 6.
How do I still remember?
And that should be impressed deeply on your,
Yeah.
we did not overlap at Santa Cruz,
No.
to my regret. And I'm a very old guy, so I'm a Prof 9, which is the top of the heap, but I'm under review this year for what's called above scale, where they then, again, have gone around and sent letters to people. But this is not to demonstrate my tree rings. I've been around for a long time, but that's not the point. The point of it is that there are ways of advancing within the system without having to do this thing, which is both a waste of energy and of ego and of other schools' times to go through it. And this is actually, both of these are a perfect example of what Lindsay Waters is talking about in terms of the offshoring of evaluation. Tell me they're worthwhile, and tell me you at that worthwhile institution what's worthwhile about it. And the other thing, and then I'll try to speak to the horrible situation you're in, but this is obviously related. The other thing is this points to that notion of commensurability and comparison. And one of the very hard things that we're struggling with on Academic Council, which is a system-wide group of us who are chairs of the different campus councils, is we have always made the argument, we've always claimed a particular group of comparators, among which I think the University of Michigan is the only public university. And then there are a lot of private universities. We cannot keep up with those. So how do you continue aspirationally to use that group, or do you move to another group of really incredibly good public universities? How do you position yourself as an institution, and then how do people position you is really a complicated issue. And there is this kind of notion that there's something out there, one of the big shifters, if it's not excellence, is quality. I mean, there are a lot of, having been a product of the Harvard department, there are a lot of better departments out there, on many regards, at least. It's a great place, but I don't know. I can't advise you to get a job in the UC system, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I really wasn't talking about, obviously about me. I
But
think
your
this is more and
situation
more
alluded
common
to.
across many of my colleagues in many universities. So I think this is, I don't know how recent a trend it is, but it certainly is something that everyone thinks they need to do now, which is an incredible waste of
That's
resources.
really interesting because it's
Yeah.
not an expectation my junior colleagues have.
At UC, I think.
At UC though,
Yeah.
I mean, this is really important. And
But Don, you know, I actually know
I'm in-
that this has been going on for decades at a variety of other institutions.
here or in Iowa,
I'm not gonna mention the institutions.
But many-
Multiple
a variety.
institutions, a variety, I did that on purpose, you really listening.
Oh, yes.
A variety of institutions, but did you hear that I said for decades?
yeah.
Well, it's recommended in a number of really popular books for people who are very junior, like PhD is not enough. There's another book I'm trying to think of, like just guides to having an academic career is recommended. That at least in a PhD is not enough, it's recommended that in your third year you start looking around. Because the idea is that you can pull, and this is really important, I think for a lot of people right now, is that at the very minimum, you can pull in money that'll sustain you while you wait your average 4 to 5 years to get your first federal grant. So, at least in my case, from NIH grants, the average person is 42 years of age. in the system as an academic for 4 to 5 years already. So that's, I mean, it's coming from a lot of different places.
That's really interesting because in the sciences and in bioanthro at Santa Cruz, you know, there's the notion that the startup package that you get is actually going to be enough to carry you through till you get your first grant, and it does turn out to work pretty well.
Well,
But there is that sense that you've got to cover this hiatus.
Yeah, and I think in my particular case, the department and the institution was very aware that this is a problem. So I feel very well supported, but I'm still looking at like 3-4 years from now. What am I going to have to do? Like ideally I land something, but what happens if I don't? So that's I mean, I guess everybody has that problem, that's
Yeah.
not new.
But I was thinking also of the burden, because I've been on job search committees where the goal of the people evaluating is this person really gonna come here, or are they using our time and money
Oh, yeah.
to get a raise somewhere else, right? And then I'm applying and competing for jobs with someone who has got a book and, you know, and so the entire field of the application process it makes other institutions do all of the evaluative work.
Yep.
And then
For
you can have a search that produces no people who, you know, for any number of reasons, but it's often a major consideration and I think burden of the people who are doing the evaluation and the people who are applying, who are saying, I'm gonna apply for this job and I'm gonna go up against somebody who's about to get tenure at this institution.
Right.
And there's not a box to check that says, no, I really am looking for, you know, like, because the end goal is that actual offer, not occasionally making it to the top rank, right? But, so I do think the burden, the offsetting is being offsetted onto often institutions who don't have the time or the money to do it, right?
And on the unpaid
Right.
faculty labor
On the
to
labor, yeah.
to do the actual.
Does anyone else suddenly find that unethical? I mean,
Which-
applying,
people going
when
on
you
the
do
market.
applying for jobs, when you have no intention of accepting the job, you're doing it to increase your salary.
But it's the only way to survive in a system that won't do it another way.
But does anybody else beside me find that unethical?
I think there's an ambiguity that we can put inside ourselves, I might go.
Right.
That ambiguity
Yeah.
is what allows us to feel like we're not
Allows the
unethical.
moral-
In fact, the process itself does damage often to candidates' relationship with their home institution,
Mhm.
because as they start to get nibbles or make it to short lists or be invited for interviews, often they're trying to find preemptive retention action here, and depending on the university or depending on the record, there's not as much movement for some
Right.
people. That starts to break down and starts to make the
Mm-hmm.
place that's very interested in you look even better. I think it's been,
Right.
in the years that I've been here, it's been part of conventional wisdom about how to get significant raises.
Mhm.
That it's a component of building your tenured desirability is news.
It's
to me.
proven, we've seen
Yeah.
it in our
Never heard
colleagues,
that.
it's not mythology, right? It's actual, we see.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm thinking about Brenda's question in terms of I was on our personnel committee for a couple of years, 2008 to 2010, which were very interesting years since the California higher education budget had collapsed along with much of the rest of the country. And two departments, one very high prestige department, and the other is, you know, good, but not as famous department. The chairs advised their faculty to go out looking for external offers because they knew that the institution was so worried about losing people to go outside as the university moved into straitened circumstances. And I thought it was pretty unethical, and it did not always lead to good results, the desired results because the notion was you get the outside offer, you didn't go, you'd stay with it. And, you know, the deans were fairly steadfast about not matching the offers unless they saw it as being a real comparator. And we had all these hair-splitting discussions about the qualitative differences between two institutions that we might know very little about.
The entering SAT scores of the students.
Right.
Right.
There's a number there.
Quantifiable, everything's
Well, as someone currently in the nomadic stage of my job process, I find this all tremendously depressing. So I'm going to change the subject. I'm curious how much you've thought about the sort of temporalities of these different domains that you've talked about. Right? I'm kind of picturing them as as planets orbiting something, right? That they occasionally line up with one another in strange and inconvenient
At the harmonic
ways.
convergence.
Right, exactly. And the ways that that shapes the prioritization, the ways that that people, academics have to prioritize them, and the ways that they influence one another.
I think I've not thought of it in terms of those temporalities per se. I love the idea, it immediately made me think of an orrery or whatever it is, these models of the solar system,
Mhm.
sort of tweak things around. I've tried to do a fair amount of thinking of, and you know, talking with colleagues about what kinds of triage might matter, what might help have a kind of cascade effect in terms of making other kinds of domains more responsive. It's really sort of hard to figure out what are in some ways serendipitous conjunctions. There is some hopeful stuff out there. Yeah, this is my role as I'm the institutional optimist, despite my papers. There's a really interesting study. There's something called the Center for Innovative Research and Graduate Education at the University of Washington, which usually has a standing NSF contract to track what happens to NSF fellows and other science PhDs 5 years and 10 years out. And a number of years ago, Mareci Nerod, who was the head of that, did it for social sciences with NSF funding. Not for 10 years out, but for 5 years out. And these are folks who got their degrees mostly in the 90s and early 2000s. And 5 years seemed to be the period in which folks often ended up with stable positions, which is a that's a temporality. How long have you been in this position?
This is my 3rd year out.
Wow, you're doing
We want to keep her too.
well, there's another thing. There's actually another heartening thing that I can mention in a sec, but more heartening than this. Yeah, but it tends to take people 5 years, and it's one of the it's actually something at ACLS where there's long been a tradition of postdocs in science, and that usually means underpaid labor, who actually are cheaper to employ than teaching fellows or teaching assistants because you don't have to pay tuition for them. And there's not been that kind of tradition really in humanities and interpretive social sciences. But Mellon and ACLS and a bunch of other institutions have really worked to try to develop postdoctoral, or you're not here on Mellon, are you? Do you have Mellon? Which kind?
Mellon
Was it?
postdoc? Humanities postdoc.
She had one.
New Directions, wasn't it?
The New Directions? Or?
2002,
And
2004.
Because there is, every year we seem to add a new postdoc program to this kind of repertoire, and they can actually really make a difference. You know, thinking about the 5-year NIMH or NIH lag time, it can really make a difference in terms of tiding somebody over to the possibility of positioning for a real job. And one of the areas that's actually really proved to work out really well is there's a relatively new program called the Public Fellows Program, which is placing people in serious NGOs or government organizations and the like, where they're doing work that draws upon their disciplinary or transdisciplinary chops. And so there are postdocs that don't operate, and that we're really concerned about not having operate in the same venal way as they often operate in the sciences. And those could help a bit again with getting positioned. They're also good in terms of cultural capital when it comes to your CV, but that's it. But there's no easy answer. I think one thing is that it's clear that at some funding agencies there really is a strong sense of how qualitative research is research.